Thank you very much, Ted, and thank you for the Jewish Federation for hosting this important Zoom meeting. We will start with Dr. Ido Baum, who will tell us about the judicial overhaul. Then I will say a few minutes. Then Jim will tell from his experiences, and then we will take questions. So it's a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Ido Baum. Dr. Baum is an associate professor of law and academic director of the Louis Brandeis Institute for Society, Economy, and Democracy at the College of Management in Israel. He is also an international visiting professor at Columbia Law School in New York City and has taught law around the world, including in Hong Kong, Germany, and at Georgetown University. Dr. Baum's bachelor's and master's of law are from Tel Aviv University, and he is a summa cum laude doctoral graduate from Hamburg University in Germany. Before joining the College of Management, Baum was spokesperson for the Ministry of Justice and later served as the legal assistant for economic and fiscal affairs to the Israeli Attorney General. In addition to his role as a professor of law, Ido Baum is also the legal affairs commentator for the leading Israeli financial newspaper, The Marker. He contributes op-eds regularly on public policy, corruption, corporate governance, and the regulation of capital markets. Ido Baum is currently one of the most prominent legal commentators in Israeli media about the proposed judicial overhaul. Baum's speech before a Knesset committee became one of the most viral video clips in Israel after he used soccer as a metaphor for democracy. Ido, please go ahead and tell us about the proposed judicial overhaul.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for this kind introduction. I hope everyone hears me well, and I won't talk about soccer today because things have gotten much more serious than they were 2 months ago. Because I have a relatively limited time limit, let me structure my talk in the following way. I'm going to explain to you, assuming that not everyone knows all this, the structure of Israeli democracy, how it's structured. Then I'm going to review the judicial overhaul. What's actually happening? What's the legislation that's being promoted at the moment? Then I'm going to talk about some other laws, because there's a focus on these specific laws that are being promoted at the moment, but Israel is actually going through a wave of legislation that this government is promoting, and it's very unusual, and you need to take stock of that. And then I'll talk a little bit about the timeout that Prime Minister Netanyahu gave us on Monday, and I'll wrap up with maybe some thoughts, very short thoughts about what you can do for Israeli democracy on your side. So let me start with the structure of Israeli democracy. What is Israeli democracy? Because it's kind of different than the democracy that you're familiar with in the United States. Historically, the structure of the Israeli government and the three branches is more similar to the situation in England, because we sort of inherited a lot of this structure from the British Mandate in 1948. So Israel does not really have your typical democratic three branches of government checking and balancing each other. Normally you have the legislature, the executive branch, and the judiciary, each checking on each other, and maybe one of them would have a bit more power than the other in certain times, but they balance each other. We don't have that. In Israel, a government can rule only if it has the majority in the parliament, in the Knesset. And if the government has the majority in the Knesset, then the government controls the Knesset entirely. The Knesset is not really an independent branch that checks and balances the government. So essentially, the government is the strongest branch in the Israeli three branches of government, and we don't have in Israel a lot of the checks and balances that are common in a lot of democracies, including the United States. For example, we don't have a full constitution. I'll talk about that in a minute. We don't have a Bill of Rights. We have our Declaration of Independence from 1948, but that's not a formal legal document. It's sort of an inspiring text. We don't have a bifurcated Congress like you have in the United States, where the Senate and the House of Representatives are being elected in different times, in different ways. We don't have that. We have one House of Parliament that's basically controlled by the government. We also don't have this federal state separation of powers, where the power of the federal government is somehow limited, and it cannot control everything within the states. We don't have that as well. The only check and balance, so to speak, for vis-a-vis the power of the government in Israel is the Supreme Court, the judiciary. And this is a branch that's being put under a significant attack by the reforms that are on the table at the moment. So I'll focus on that, and I'll try to show you that the judiciary is under attack, but actually the reforms are much broader than what we're talking about now. And so we have to focus on that. Let me just say something about Israeli constitution. We don't have one. The reason we don't have one is that in 1948, when Israel was established, Israel was supposed to have a constitution. That's actually one of the expectations of the United Nations when Israel was set up. However, over the first 2 years after negotiations, it turned out, mainly because of disagreements between the leadership of Israel at the time, by David Ben-Gurion on the Orthodox parties, that they could not agree on a constitution. And then they did what is typical for Israel in 1950. They agreed on a compromise. The compromise is a very well-known constitutional event in Israel. It's called the Harari decision, after the name of the member of Knesset that suggested it. And he basically said, let's make a piecemeal constitution. Let's pass basic laws that we can agree on when we agree on them. And in the end, we'll take all these basic laws and form one big constitution. And over the years, some basic laws were passed. Those are that everyone agreed on. Basic law, Jerusalem, the capital of Israel. Basic law, the army. Basic law, the government, that says what are the powers of the government. Basic law, the judiciary, that says how we elect judges. However, there were disagreements, stark disagreements on basic laws regarding human rights in Israel. Only in 1992, two basic laws that give constitutional protections to human rights were passed. These are basic law freedom of occupation, which protects a very particular human right or civil right, and basic law human dignity and liberty. That's Israel's main text that protects civil and human rights. It protects property rights, it protects privacy, it protects a due process, but there are a lot of constitutional rights that you're familiar with in the United States that have no formal constitutional protection in Israel. For example, equality of human beings and of citizens is not protected constitutionally in Israel. Freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of demonstration, those are not protected constitutionally in Israel. Freedom of religion and freedom from religion, those are not protected in Israel. These are an example of the kind of rights that the politicians could not agree on, and so they're not enacted into basic laws. As of 1992, since we have this basic law, human rights and dignity, the court in Israel, the Supreme Court in Israel, has been granted the power of judicial review. That means that if the Knesset enacts a law that contradicts rights that are protected under basic laws and does not follow certain standards that allow for this kind of breaches of human rights, then the Supreme Court can strike down laws that are unconstitutional. I should say the Supreme Court has done this extremely carefully and extremely rarely. Since 1992, so we have more than 30 years, the Israeli Supreme Court struck down only 22 sections, not laws, not full laws, sections of law. If you compare that, for example, to the United States, and federal courts strike down approximately 7 to 8 times more laws. So for every law struck down in Israel, there are 7 to 8 laws being struck down in the United States. In fact, constitutional scholars that measure this say that Israeli Supreme Court is one of the most conservative and careful courts in stepping into the acts of the legislature. I should also say that, and that says something about the instability of human rights in Israel and of protection of democracy and rights in Israel. The basic laws in Israel have been amended a lot of times. Over the last 20 years, there have been 40 amendments to the basic laws in Israel. Just to compare, in more than 240 years of amendments in the United States, there have been 27 amendments. So 27 in 240 years vis-a-vis 40 amendments in the last 20 years in Israel, and we don't have a full constitution at the moment. So that tells you something about the instability and the social rifts and understandings in Israel. So this is more or less the structure that we're looking at. This is called thin democracy by most scholars of political science and law. So what's the overall about? What are we seeing now over the last 3 months? What kind of legislation is being pushed? And I'm going to go through some of the legislation. Some of it actually passed. And some of it is being challenged and some not. So I'm going to focus on the main issues. There are about 9 laws that I'm going to go through. But what you should think about is more like the forest rather than the trees, because this, when you look at all the legislation, you realize what kind of a dramatic change whoever is pushing this legislation is trying to bring about. So number one, probably the most important, the one that obviously no one's going to surrender on both parties, is taking over the judiciary. There have been various proposals, but the gist of the proposals by those who are pushing this judicial overall is that the coalition will appoint its own judges. At the moment, the appointment of judges in Israel is done by a committee of 9 members, where there are 4 politicians, usually all from the coalition. The coalition can give one spot. They used to do that to an opposition member. They stopped doing that. So there's 4 members of the coalition, 2 ministers and 2 members of the Knesset, 2 members of the bar, of the Lawyers Association, and 3 judges, including one of them would be the president of the Supreme Court. It takes 7 out of 9 to appoint a judge to the Supreme Court. We have 15 judges on the Supreme Court, and it takes only 5 out of 9 to appoint a judge to all the other instances in the Israeli judicial system. That actually means that the judges, and this is a slogan that's going around, judges appoint judges in Israel. Judges cannot appoint judges in Israel because there are only 3 out of 9. They will have to get either the politicians or the lawyers on board to appoint whoever, if they want to appoint someone in any of the instances. And the judges certainly cannot appoint a judge to the Supreme Court without the agreement of the politicians. To appoint a judge to the Supreme Court, you need 7 out of 9. That also means that the politicians cannot appoint their own appointments to the court without having an agreement for at least one of the judges on this committee. That caused, over the years, a process of negotiations. Whenever they wanted to appoint someone to the Supreme Court, the politicians and the judges needed to negotiate. Either they could find someone they agreed on, or what often happened was a sort of a trade-off. If the judges want someone, the politician would support him or her, and if the politicians wanted someone else, then the judges would support the politician's candidate, and so they would always appoint 2 judges or 4 judges, 2 that the politicians wanted and 2 that the judges thought are more suitable, and the politicians agreed to support. So it was always compromise appointments. The change now is that the coalition, the proposed change is that the coalition will be able to appoint its own judges. No opposition power to block appointments. The judges will no longer have a veto power. I've been in the States over the last month, and people have told me, and that's why I'm making a point here before going all over the rest of the legislation. And people told me, what's wrong with political appointments to the judiciary? We see that in the United States. That's the way it works in the States. This is a completely different system. Even in the United States, first of all, when a president nominates a judge, he has to pass the Senate. He has to be confirmed by the Senate. This will not happen in Israel. No president has a guarantee, systematic guarantee that a nominee will pass the Senate. We know that. That's happened a lot in the United States. And besides, even if you appoint political candidates to the Supreme Court, you have the federal and state system. So there is no situation where taking over one court means taking over the entire judicial system. This is what's going on in Israel. Taking over the Judicial Selection Committee by the coalition means taking over the entire judicial system. There's only one country, one so-called advanced country in the world that it has a similar system at the moment, and that's Poland. And Poland is experiencing a serious democratic backslide since 2015, when the ultra right-wing conservative Law and Justice party came to power there. So this is the key reform. Now, what's going on top of this reform? There is the issue of judicial review of basic laws. The issue of taking over the Judicial Selection Committee, this is an amendment to the basic law of the judiciary. It has already passed almost all the stages of legislation. It was supposed to be confirmed into law this week. It was stopped on the brink of passing. This is number one. The second thing that's been stopped on the brink of passing is the judicial review of basic laws. Basically, this change means that the Supreme Court will never be able to review basic laws, never at all. By saying on top of the law, giving it the title basic law, it will basically shield that law from any judicial review in terms of the constitutionality of what will be written in this basic law. Now, this is strange because to this day, the Supreme Court of Israel has never struck down a single basic law or an amendment to the basic law. And this is something that concerns a lot of Israelis, because they think, why is the government, why is this coalition promoting an abolishment of judicial review of basic laws? Maybe what people are planning, what the coalition is planning, is passing basic laws that will be unconstitutional in their nature. That's a matter of grave concern. Now, let's talk about regular laws. As I told you, the Israeli Supreme Court is very careful in striking down regular laws that have been held to be unconstitutional, done so only in 22 cases to date. Nevertheless, the proposition is that there will be a requirement for a supermajority of 12 out of 15 judges to strike down a regular law. Actually, there is no country that has such a supermajority, no democracy that has such a supermajority, and that's going to basically mean that the potential for a review of regular laws for unconstitutionality is going to decrease significantly. Even in the States, 5 to 4 judges can strike down a law in the Supreme Court. Another proposition is called the override clause. It seems like the coalition is backing off this idea. The override clause means that even if the Supreme Court, with its coalition judges, with its abolishing, with not looking at basic laws, only regular laws, if by chance the Supreme Court will strike down a regular law, then the parliament, the Knesset, will be able to reinstate that law, that unconstitutional law, with a regular majority of 61 members of the Knesset that the coalition always has. Members of the coalition said they were willing to waive this amendment because they said it's probably superfluous given the other amendments that they're pushing through. Something that already passed is change to the basic law of the government that says when you can remove the prime minister from office. Now it's really difficult to remove the prime minister from office. This law has passed last week. It means that the prime minister could be removed for basically only for medical reasons, and only with a supermajority of the members of his own cabinet. It's a bit like the amendments that you have in the United States in that sense. And this perhaps explains why, despite challenges, the Supreme Court decided not to do anything about this amendment, and it's now in power. And actually Netanyahu decided to step into the event of the overhaul after that law was passed. Ministerial appointments. As this government was formed, the Supreme Court disqualified the appointment of Aryeh Deri from the Shas party, the ultra-Orthodox Sephardi party, to be a minister in the government, because Deri was convicted of bribery, and he was convicted of tax evasion, and with a series of convictions, the court said it makes no sense to, it's unreasonable, extremely unreasonable to appoint such a person to a position of a minister. So one of the propositions by the government is that the court will not be able to review at all any appointments to positions of ministers by the government. This is called the Deri Amendment. At the moment, this week, Deri himself said that he would like to stop the enactment of this amendment, probably in an effort to reach an overall compromise. So that would be actually amendment number 6. Amendment number 7 that's being pushed has to do more with the executive branch. We're talking about a lot of judicial amendments that have to do with the legislation. Regarding the executive branch, there's a proposition to abolish the standard of review of extreme reasonableness. This is a very rare standard of review, actually. Only 5% of executive branch decisions, of government decisions, have been disqualified by the court for being extremely unreasonable. There are a lot of other standards, and this is a fairly vague standard, so the court actually tries to avoid it. But the idea is to abolish it altogether. And I think about this because I guess every one of us in his interaction with administrative authorities sometimes runs into a wall of irrationality, and then you'd like the court to intervene. The court in Israel will not be able to do this anymore. The attorney generals and the legal advisors in the Israeli ministers. In Israel, attorney generals and legal advisors in government ministries are gatekeepers. They are civil servants, they're not politically appointed, and they are supposed to be gatekeepers against corruption. Basically, they can tell a minister, what you're trying to do is illegal, and if you do that, I will not be able to protect you in court. So the government actually wants to cancel this gatekeeping authority of the legal advisors. The proposition is that legal advisors will now be political appointments, and that their legal advice will no longer be compelling on the minister. So that's two moves that will basically ruin the idea of the legal advisor in Israel. That's I would say the half half authority that adds to the Supreme Court's power as a check and balance on the executive branch. There's a lot of issues.
Ido, 5 more minutes, please. Thank you.
Okay, so there's a lot of issues. I'm nearing to an end. There are a lot of issues that have to do with law and order. A law that already passed is the police changes to the police ordinance that give the Minister of National Security, Itamar Ben-Gvir from Otzma Yehudit, an ultra right-wing member of the coalition, the power to give policy directives to the police. This law has already passed. It's being challenged in the Supreme Court, and the Israeli Attorney General already mentioned that Itamar Ben-Gvir, the minister, has abused this authority to give direct, concrete orders rather than policy instruction to the ministries. This gives you an idea of what's going on, but there is, on top of this, about 150 law. This is an unprecedented number. 150 bills of law that are being pushed through by the government as we speak, and they're in various stages. For example, political donations to ministers and their family members to cover costs of trials and medical expenses. That, for example, would allow a minister or the child of a minister to get crowdfunding to or a donation to filing slap lawsuits against me or you. For example, exempting and immunizing IDF soldiers from investigations on military actions in the territories. Now, this sounds good, but actually the independent investigations of actions of soldiers in the territories are what immunizes them from international criminal courts. There were examples for that over the last months. For example, with the shooting of Palestinian-American journalist Shirin Abu Akleh, Israel conducted its own independent investigation that actually immunized Israel from the intervention of Europe and the United States over that event. There's legislation that's Orthodox oriented, for example, expanding the the authority of rabbinical courts to adjudicate civil cases. And this is very bad for women in Israel, because if women in Israel will be compelled to be adjudicated under a rabbinical court that adjudicate according to the Orthodox interpretation of Jewish law, then this tends to be negative, to have negative implications on women. There are a lot of examples. So let me wrap this up by saying you need to look not at the individual legislation, not at the trees. You could argue that some of this legislation has sense or could be rationalized. But if you look at the whole process, you see that this is a process that's directed at changing Israel fundamentally to a different country than it is today. It's unprecedented. It's unprecedented in the speed. It's unprecedented in the number of laws. It's unprecedented in the fact that it's not inclusive. It's being pushed through by a certain part of the coalition. Polls from the last week show that 60% of Israelis want democracy. 60% of Israelis want this legislation to be halted, and they want changes, but they want it to be achieved through a process of deliberation and compromises, and not through the way in the way that the government is going on at the moment. We're in a historic moment. On Monday, after Netanyahu announced that he fires the Minister of Defense for saying that this legislation creates a situation that might pose negative implications on national security. By the way, Netanyahu has not sent the actual letter of dismissal to this minute. So it's sort of the Minister of Defense is sort of hanging in the air. On Monday, after probably the most tremendous spontaneous demonstration that Israel has ever seen, Netanyahu announced a timeout From a legal perspective, this is a very complicated announcement, because saying that there's a timeout does not mean that the legislation is stopped. As I said, there are two laws that are actually on the brink, the two most important laws that are on the brink of passing. The politicians are now moving to the president's residence for discussions on compromise. But if these two laws are still on the brink of passing, then these are negotiations with a gun on the table, with the barrel of the gun pointed at the negotiators. So this is a problem in terms of negotiating. And therefore, a lot of people are skeptical about the possibility of these negotiations succeeding. And Netanyahu said that he's going to pass the reform in the summer session of the Knesset. So by July, he wants to pass whatever reform that comes through. And as I said, he has the legislation on the table. One last thing that I'd like to say about what you can do. I think public support for democracy is really important. Democracy is not a matter of right-wing or left-wing or any social chasm. Democracy is a matter for the future and for the next generations of Israel. And if you care about democracy, I think you should get involved. I'm not an expert on how to get the United States involved. I guess you write to your congressman. You can ask Shaul what to do. You could go to a demonstration. You can write an email. You can do something. If you care about democracy, then you should take a stand. This is not a stand against the government of Israel. I know from speaking to a lot of Americans that it's really difficult to say something against the government of Israel. But this is not against the government of Israel. This is for democracy in Israel. I think if you care about Israel continuing to be a democratic Jewish country, then you should take a stand and get involved. Thank you.